Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of A Conversation with Cometan. We are here today on my birthday, the 1st of July. Of course, this video will be going out in a few weeks' time, but this is a very special day today, not only because it's my birthday, but also because we're celebrating the beginning of the establishment era in Astronist history. So I'm going to be doing another video today as well, recording. So I'm really excited today to be presenting to you episode 15 of A Conversation with Cometan. Of course, we're on season 2 now, coming towards the end of season 2, really. But today, really what I wanted to go through is some of my PhD work, actually, which is a little bit different from a lot of the other videos that have been taken place this season, which have mainly centered on my work with Astronism. Of course, Astronism is my main work, it's my life's vocation, but at the moment I'm also very heavily involved in the human rights sphere, and specifically the religious freedom sphere. And of course, this is a lot of what my time at the moment is being taken up with research and just writing about this topic. So today I'm going to really be introducing you to the specific area of freedom of religion or belief that I'm focusing on, which is what I've called religious recognition. So recognition of religion or belief essentially refers to primarily, but not always, but primarily the state recognizing and registering religious activity, the religious beliefs and activities or related activities of the citizens. And so what I'm looking at in my PhD is how governments across the world use recognition, either in good ways or in bad ways, primarily looking, of course, in the negative ways that they use recognition in order to try and resolve some of these ongoing issues. And today I'm going to be introducing you to really my hypothesis, my sort of area of interest, which is and sort of my theory essentially, which is what I call recognitionism. And of course, there you can see we're also using the brand new Cometan logo, which has been redesigned again to commemorate the beginning of the establishment era. So lots of new things taking place. We've also got here today my celestial sphere as well, or the armillary sphere, you could also call it that. So it's a little bit of a prop in the background, which is something different as well. So we're changing, with new things are happening, and it's all very exciting. And of course, today is my birthday as well. So an extra special day for that. So really what this presentation is trying to achieve is essentially an understanding of what recognition of religion or belief means, and the different types of religious recognition by the state, but also within the society itself, and essentially trying to get across to you the importance of recognition in the field of human rights, in the field specifically of freedom of religion or belief. So I'll give a brief overview of how governments use recognition as a tool to enhance religious activity or to inhibit it, and then also explain my theory of recognitionism and sort of how I hope to change and sort of try and enhance and try and resolve some of the ongoing issues in the religious freedom advocacy landscape. So just a little bit of background about me. If you've never come across me before, my name's Cometan, and I'm here today talking to you about my doctoral research. That's just a picture of me last year holding my master's dissertation. My master's dissertation wasn't focused on human rights at all, actually. It was about the origins of religion in prehistoric times. So very different from my PhD work now. But of course, my PhD work is very, very interesting. It's exploring topics that are of immense importance in the contemporary age. And essentially what I'm exploring, as I've said, is that how and sort of the role of recognition in government systems, how recognition is used to restrict or alleviate religious activity or to enhance religious activity. Specifically, of course, I'm looking at how it's restricting it. So how does the fact that Iran, for example, recognizing Islam as the state religion and then sort of claiming to recognize different minorities, but not really giving those minorities the true religious freedom that they deserve, how does that affect the broader religious freedom landscape within that country, but also in other countries around the world? That's essentially what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how the state restricts religious activity and how recognition can be used to do that. So my hypothesis really centers on the idea that recognition is important. So for the first part of my thesis, I've spoken about how recognition is essential to the building of identity, distinguishing groups from one another, how recognition from the state is important in terms of a very practical purpose, in terms of the legal protections that state recognition provides, but then also I'm looking at how recognition in a social setting is sort of, well, enhances a group's ability to be accepted in the society. If a group is not recognized by the state, it is more likely to face discrimination, persecution maybe in more extreme cases, but just sort of social ostracism if it isn't recognized than if it was recognized by the state. So my theory of recognitionism essentially wants to provide a series of tools that can be implemented to use recognition in a good way, but also to recognize the power of recognition, ironically, to recognize that power of that recognition has in the freedom of religion landscape and how that really does affect the day-to-day lives of minorities. So I've spoken a little bit about this broader topic of religious recognition. Essentially what I'm speaking about there is either a state's recognition of the validity of a religious group to exist, or the society's, the public's recognition of that religious group to exist. And of course, what I'm trying to say there is that not that the state is affirming, affirmation is something different. Affirmation is where the state is saying that a religion is true or that a religion is right. And it's the state sort of backing that religion. And of course, that is what we generally refer to as a state religion. That's different from what I've spoken about here when we speak about recognition. What I'm speaking about here with recognition is simply, very, very simply, just acknowledging that a group exists, not giving it any affirmation, not saying that it is true or right, or that its practices are true or right, just literally acknowledging its existence. That's why sometimes I refer to recognition specifically as existential recognition. So it's the state recognizing the existence of a group and the validity of that group to exist. Not the validity of the group to be correct in what it believes, but in the validity of the group to merely exist. Okay, so that's all I'm asking for when I'm speaking about recognition here. I'm speaking about the recognition of a group to exist. So the role of recognition is one that is essential to really the provision of identity in society. If I don't recognize you and you don't recognize me, and the conversation declines, it sort of devolves into this situation where there's no acceptance between each other, and that of course, incites discrimination, and even maybe even extremism as well at the same time. I really do believe, and this is at the center of recognitionism, is that I really do believe that recognition, or in many cases lack thereof, or misrecognition, sort of recognizing something as being something that what it is or what it claims to be, is essential really to a lot of the issues that are taking place in society today. For example, terrorism, discrimination, social ostracism of new religious movements or converts to sort of untraditional religions. So I really do think that recognition plays a central role in identity in a society, and that really it embodies sort of this identification of something, as I've said there, as belonging to a particular category, or as embodying a certain set of characteristics. So what I'm trying to say there is that when a state recognizes a belief system, for example, like Christianity, the state is recognizing that Christianity is valid to exist, that Christians therefore exist, and that Christian organizations and denominations therefore exist, and that they have the validity to do so, that they have the right to do so. Not that their beliefs and practices are valid or true or correct or right, but that they have the right to exist, and that they are accepted in their existence. That's what recognition, of course, is trying to speak about here. That's what we're trying to encourage states to try to engage with this more. Just as recognition can and is used positively and negatively, so, recognition can be used for good and it can be used for bad. Of course, in places like China, Russia, and some of those other countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, some of these very terminal countries in terms of their human rights records, recognition is used in a bad way. It is not used in a way that it should be. It is used in a way to restrict religious activity, but also to justify persecution of certain religious groups. So recognition certainly can be used in a negative way, but it can also be used in a positive way. You can look at countries like Iceland, like Cyprus, Belgium to some degree, and other European countries, and some in the Americas, where recognition is used in a good way. It's used to validate a religion's or a new religious movement's existence. It's used to help to bring that religious group into the society, to accept and spread the message of diversity, and to spread the message of improvements in religious education. So definitely recognition is positive and negative, can be used in either way. But I think the fact that it can be shows its power, okay? And that's what I'm trying to get across here, is that recognition is very, very powerful, and that it is not used enough it's not spoken about enough in international human rights law, and it is not given enough attention by, for example, the United Nations, when, we're trying to get these countries to improve their human rights records, okay? Also, something that's interesting is that, I think that recognition definitely has a role in other areas of human rights. I'm not just saying that it's part of freedom of religion. Of course, that's my area of interest and my area of expertise, but it's not just part of freedom of religion or belief. It could be used in other areas, definitely so, in women's rights, in gender equality, in even things like child labor and things like this, things that are taking place, these human rights abuses that are taking place, even animal rights as well are the same thing. So I think recognition, or lack thereof, is probably one of the main issues that is taking place at the moment, and one of the main causes of many of the issues in the world. So really, to affirm as well as to deny is what recognition is doing. So recognition can affirm a group, or it can deny a group. And of course, it can be projected. So recognition can, so that means recognizing what something is, And it can also be revoked. It can be taken away, recognizing what something is not. Okay, so recognition is it's got multi dimensions, and it can also be used, of course, as I've said, in a positive way and a negative way. So there's already established what we call in philosophy recognition theory, which looks at its branch of sort of sociology and philosophy that looks at recognition and its role in society, and historically as well, its role. And there's some key philosophers who've spoken about this: Immanuel Kant, Axel Honneth, and Charles Taylor are just some that I've been researching at the moment for my thesis. And of course, each of these philosophers has contributed in different ways to understanding recognition and its role in society. Of course, my goal in my life is to be able to stand alongside those philosophers and to contribute to recognition theory in any way that I can, and also to, but I think my role really, I see, and my area of interest is to apply recognition in the world, is to apply recognitionism in the world, specifically in human rights law. So again, we're just going to continue to look at this role of recognition. All countries around the world have approaches to how religion and belief is registered and recognized in their territory. So each country around the world has different laws, policies about how it approaches the religious lives of its citizens. Of course, some countries don't care about the right of freedom of religion, whereas others do, and they protect that right. So there is a huge spectrum here of countries for all around the world. And of course, I'll be looking at those a little bit later on about those different categories. I'll be showing you the different categories that I've outlined that there exists. So recognition and registration, of course, are found in legislations of all countries around the world. Recognition can be used either to enhance standards of freedom of religion or belief, or to violate this human right. We kind of already spoke about this a little bit earlier on. This idea that recognition can be used, as I've said, to enhance the human right or to violate it. And what that basically means is that the state can use recognition in a way that that may protect one group, but may not protect the universality of the citizens. So recognition may be used to protect, for example, Muslims in Saudi Arabia, for example, but that same recognition system is not being used to protect Christians in that country. So what I'm trying to say there is that in each country, there exists a recognition system that may or may not, to varying degrees, protect different groups. So it may protect a few groups, one group, no groups at all. It may protect the majority of groups, but new religious movements, for example, which of course receive the most amount of persecution, the most amount of discrimination out of all groups, all religious groups, it may not protect those. So it may protect all the traditional religions that you know about, but it may not protect all of the new religious movements. Okay, may refer to them as cults, for example, which is it's just not in the spirit of freedom of religion or belief, is it? So governments vary considerably in how they structure their recognition systems and how they use them to regulate religious activity. Some governments use their authority to recognize for good and to enrich religious activity, while others use recognition for the opposite, to debilitate religious activity in all or most of its forms. So basically what I'm trying to say there is that, of course, yes, governments are sometimes good at protecting some people's religious freedoms, but in other cases, they try and debilitate, they actively are debilitating religious activity in these countries. How a government deals with religious recognition reflects its entire approach to freedom of religion or belief itself. Of course, Most countries around the world have signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Not all countries, but a vast majority have signed that. Just because they've signed that doesn't mean that they are practicing what it says, of course. And really what I see, the way that governments are approaching recognition of religion is reflective or emblematic, really, of the broader approach that that government is taking to the religious lives of its citizens and respecting the religious lives of its citizens. So you may have heard me say so far, of course, recognition, but then registration. And I think these two words often get muddled up, and this is why I'm again why I'm doing my PhD, is to sort of clarify as well some of these inconsistencies within the terminology, trying to show distinctions between how these terms differ essentially. So we've got recognition. I refer to this technically, as I've said, as existential recognition. So this is the recognition of something as valid right to exist. So as holding a valid right to exist. This is usually bestowed to a belief system, denomination, or a related group. So what I mean by that is that recognition is bestowed to either something like Christianity, or as a belief system, as a denomination, for example, the Catholic Church, and then a related community, which would be the Catholic community, the community of Catholic people, Catholics. That would be the related community, okay? Then you've got registration. So recognition is very much abstract. So it's recognizing belief systems, communities, things that aren't legal or abstract or aren't concrete. Whereas registration is, of course, what I generally call technically legal recognition or legal registration, which is the identification and protection of the group under the law. So this is usually bestowed to an organization or a single religious building. So, of course, sorry, I should have said them back then about the denomination. It would be Roman Catholicism would be the denomination, and then the organization would be Roman Catholic Church, because that is an organization, not a denomination. Okay, so there's a little bit of semantic differences here in the meanings of these words. But essentially what I'm trying to say here is that recognition is for abstract entities, collections of beliefs and how they relate to one another, and also communities. And then registration is for things that are physical. So an organization that represents a denomination, for example, or a single religious building, of course, which is a physical entity. So in the vast majority of countries, recognition and registration are amalgamated with registration often emphasized in legislation as the primary means of achieving any semblance of recognition. So what I'm trying to say there is that existential recognition or true existential recognition is very rare actually in legislation. Of course, we have it in things like Iran, where Iran recognizes Islam as the state religion, so that's a form of existential recognition, but the existential recognition there has been skewed, it has been pushed to the extreme. It recognizes minorities like Christians and Zoroastrians, but the Iranian government doesn't provide them with the same recognition as Islam and Muslims receive. Okay, so, or their specific denomination actually, because it's Shia Islam, not Sunni Islam, and not generally Islam either. So what I'm trying to say there is that in the majority of legislations, there is a focus on this legal registration rather than just, or in addition to, the existential recognition of a belief system or a denomination or a community, okay? And in majority of cases, wherever existential recognition is bestowed, it is bestowed in a way that really contravenes the spirit of freedom of religion or belief. It is used in a way not to enhance religious activity, but actually to debilitate religious activities that it does not recognize, okay? Then, of course, in recognitionist theory, it is recommended that these two forms of recognition be differentiated. So in the majority of countries, there's a focus on registration, but in the majority of countries, recognition and registration are amalgamated. They are considered as one, okay? They are not distinguished. There is no distinguish between recognition and registration. Whereas in my theory, the recognitionist theory, I'm saying that those two sort of forms of recognition, you could say, should be differentiated, that they mean different things and they are applied to different entities, okay? So this is just beginning to get into the distinctions between recognition and restriction and registration. So again, a similar slide here, we're going to be looking at regulation and restriction and the differences between these. Sorry for all the similarly sounding words, but I really do think it's important to distinguish between these similar terms. So we've got regulation and restriction. We'll begin with regulation. Regulation are, I define them as appropriate policies put in place to control the actions and activities of religious organizations that do not correspond to violations of freedom of religion or belief. I've put an example of which there, which I was going to put was, I won't include it in, but I was just going to put that it was to do with, for example, when a country puts in regulations against terrorism, for example, or against, public demonstrations that may cause the incitement of hatred, for example, of a specific group. We need to have regulations for that. And I think that's appropriate. I think in some religious freedom documentations, I think it can go so far where you can get away with doing anything under the guise of religion, and I don't think that's right. I think I think there is definitely a line that should not be crossed, and I think everyone really knows what that line is. You shouldn't be inciting violence or hatred against any other group just because you disagree with them. You shouldn't be, you shouldn't be disturbing the public order. And again, the problem is that, yes, that term public order is used a lot, and it is a subjective word because it can be interpreted very, very broadly. This is why I believe we need a recognition agency that we can trust as an independent body to manage that and to make sure that the manipulation of the legislation does not take place, or its politicization. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that regulation, even though the term may be used in things like China for its very, very restrictive activities on religion, I define regulation as appropriate policies. These are things that do not violate freedom of religion or belief, okay? Whereas restriction, of course, does violate religion or belief. And it can kind of be related to this idea of sort of an unjust regulation. These are policies set forth by governments that really control religious activity in a way that is unnecessary, in a way that is, sorry for having to finish this, in a way that is unnecessary, okay? These countries don't need to be stopping the building of religious places of worship just because they don't like the religion that is building that building. Okay, so these are things like controlling religious activity, controlling when religious activities can take place, where they can take place, who can conduct those religious activities, the internal affairs of those religious organizations controlled by governments is just unnecessary. It's inappropriate. And it violates freedom of religion or belief, okay? So I'm making a distinction there between the two. I'm seeing regulation as appropriate. These are things that are classified as appropriate policies that control religious activity. And then restriction, of course, is inappropriate things that don't need to be in place, that do violate religious freedom. So part of the work in freedom of religion or belief is continually demarcating the line between regulation, appropriate, and restriction, inappropriate. Okay, so that's constantly what I'm doing all the time, is trying to justify and trying to say what is appropriate and what is inappropriate control of religion, what is inappropriate regulation and what is appropriate regulation of religious activity. Okay. So, of course, that's just an ongoing thing. We can't get around it. There's always going to be that line that we have to not cross, and the line may move, but we always know what, crossing that line, we know what we do when we cross that line. It's violating someone else's freedom of religion. It's conducting acts of terror. It's inciting hatred, things like that. So section 2, I'm going to just quickly introduce my theory of recognitionism and what I sort of see as really the future of freedom of religion or belief, hopefully. The future of how we can deal with freedom of religion or belief and how we can improve it around the world. So really, recognitionism is both a theory, but it's also a framework, and it's also an approach to freedom of religion or belief. And it essentially focuses, of course, on the concept of recognition, but it focuses on this idea of recognition as being powerful, as being a powerful means of attaining higher conditions for freedom of religion, okay? It is focusing on this idea that or of maintaining high conditions, okay? It's basically saying that recognition can be used in a way that is positive, and that in a way that will enhance religious freedoms. So in recognitionist theory, recognition is valued is viewed as a valuable principal tool at the disposal of both governments and citizens. And of course, citizens do have a role in this. It's not just about governments, it's about citizens standing up as well for injustices of religious freedoms and belief freedoms, okay? And also practices, that the state is engaging in that may restrict religious activity, okay? So what I see essentially recognitionism as is advocating for the use of recognition to enhance religious freedoms. So, of course, recognitionism places an all importance on recognition and its functions. Of course, this often means democratizing recognition for all religious and belief groups, whether these be old or young, large or small, powerful or weak, organized or unorganized. So there's all these different characteristics of religious groups. These don't matter. You still deserve recognition otherwise. It doesn't matter whether you are large or small, big, powerful or weak. It doesn't matter. You still deserve recognition. So recognition is not in a vacuum, though. It does not exist in a vacuum from other tools. And it should be seen as part of a broader collection of tools, in addition to things like diplomacy, interfaith dialogue, things like that. It should be seen as together with those things to bring together a collection of tools for maintaining freedom of religion or belief. And this is something that's ongoing as well. Someone who I was speaking to the other day who isn't really involved in human rights, but they were interested, but they said they were interested in what I was doing, but then they said, well, in the UK, we have freedom of religion, so what's the issue? Well, there is an issue because in the majority of countries around the world, they don't have the same rights that we have. They don't have the power just to walk out the street and talk to someone about their own religion. They don't have the power to set up their own organized religion or their organization of beliefs, okay? Or to even speak about their beliefs in public, as I've just said. So this is a very much ongoing thing. Say that recognitionism reaches its goal and every country around the world becomes high standards for freedom of religion or belief. Say that. Even if we get to that stage, freedom of religion or belief will still need to be maintained. Okay, there will still be things that come along, politics, natural disasters, pandemics, things that take place that will put into jeopardy or put into concern freedom of religion or belief. So this is not just a case of getting to a particular stage and then we're done. This is a case of an ongoing protection of the religious freedoms. So as long as human beings are alive, there will always be a need for freedom of religion or belief. Okay, it's a fundamental human right that is a core to who we are, essentially. It is core to who we are as human beings, really. It distinguishes us from every other species on the planet or every other species that has ever been on this planet. Okay. So there are a couple of components of recognitionism. The first is really the sort of aim, really, is the process of perfecting the recognition system of a country. We call this process dynamization. The reason why we call it that is because the highest level in the spectrum of religious recognition is dynamism, or the dynamic characteristic. So dynamization is really the perfecting of a religious recognition system. Okay, so that's the first component. The second one is that it wants to establish a country's recognition system so that it serves its purpose effectively and resembles the necessary attributes of accessibility, equitability, and visibility. So what I'm trying to say there is that, yes, there should exist a recognition system within a country, and that recognition system should be accessible. So it should be sort of available, accessible to all religious groups, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe, no matter how big they are, how small they are, how rich they are, how poor they are. It should be accessible to all. That they should be treated equally during the registration and recognition processes. So obviously that means equitability. And visibility refers to sort of that genuine bestowal of recognition and registration, okay? Not just that a government is like Iran saying that, well, Christians are recognized as minorities, yet they have hardly any really true freedoms to actually engage in, for example, proselytism or open public worship, or even to have major holidays, for example. Those things are restricted, if not completely prohibited. So that is a case of where recognition is falsely bestowed. So what visibility is trying to push it back against is saying that a visible recognition system is one that genuinely bestows recognition, that sort of a pseudo recognition, a false recognition, will not take place if the recognition system is visible to the public and engages with the public, and is also authoritative as well. So we come into here, the next thing here, which is, so we've got the perfecting of the religious recognition system, the establishment of a recognition system, and also finally founding an independent recognition agency. I've spoken a little bit about this earlier. A recognition agency is what I see as an independent agency to deal with religious activity in a country, specifically recognition, of course, and registration of religious activity, but also to facilitate religious activity, to enhance it, to develop it, to enhance and welcome new religious movements. And of course, in doing that, the recognition agency must firstly be accountable. It must secondly be autonomous. And it must thirdly be authoritative in managing the established recognition system. What I'm trying to say there is that, of course, a recognition agency that is independent of government needs to be accountable to democracy. It needs to be accountable to the citizens. It needs to be accountable to some degree government itself, as long as government does not get involved. It needs to be accountable to something so that the recognition agency is regulated itself to ensure that the agency itself is being properly run and fairly run. And of course, it needs to be autonomous. It needs to be autonomous from the government, independent of the government, but it also needs to retain the same authority that the government has. It needs to possess the authority that the government has in its decisions and actions. If a recognition agency has no authority, then there's no point of it existing, because it's not going to be able to sort of affirm and command the recognition of a religious group if it doesn't have that authority. So now we're moving on to section 3, which is going to focus a little bit on sort of my theories really of religious recognition. And these are just some things that have emerged so far really from my PhD research. Of course, all of this has come from my PhD research, but these are just some frameworks that I've developed so far for my PhD research. This is what I call the spectrum of religious recognition. Okay, so this is a series of 7 categories that I've identified that exist in the world by looking at all the different countries. I've identified that these 7 categories exist, and that really what they are is how different countries approach religious recognition, essentially, and how they use religious recognition either for good or for bad. Let's begin. We'll begin with dynamic, actually. Apologies there. We'll begin with dynamic, looking at how really the top, this is the perfect or ideal, because there's no perfect system, but this is the ideal system that we, or I have devised, that I think would work in and needs to be in order to really get to a stage with religious freedom that is a good stage, a good condition. So we've got what we call dynamic. Okay, this is where there exists, as I've said before, a differentiation between registration and recognition. Okay, so there are 2 separate procedures for legal registration of a religious organization, and then existential recognition of a belief system or a denomination or a religious community. Okay, so there's those 2 separate procedures, and these are differentiated in order really to cater really for these different forms of recognition and how they exist in different levels as well, different levels of existence in the state. So of course, belief systems are nationwide, whereas a single religious building is just in a singular place. So, you know, that shows again the difference between the different levels, that there are local, national, or you could say local, provincial, national, and then international levels of recognition. Okay. Still part of dynamic, we have this system that is adaptive and that really holds the capacity to recognize, as I've said, at multiple levels simultaneously. That really, it maintains relations with groups, with different religious groups, religious and belief groups. It provides sufficient services to them. So it provides help and support to these groups. It provides, as I've said, just general services to the members of these groups to facilitate their religious activities, and also creates a culture that not only accepts emerging groups and new religious movements, but encourages their development to diversify and enhance belief and practice. So what I'm trying to say there is that, of course, a dynamic government, a dynamic religious recognition system is one that really encourages new religious movements to form, encourages emerging groups to emerge and encourages their development. So a recognition system then possesses the attributes of authority, autonomy, and accountability. So as I've said before, just now, a recognition system needs to have those three qualities, or the recognition agency, sorry, needs to have those three qualities in order to ensure that it is accountable to the public, that it is conducting itself in the right way, but that it is autonomous from government, and that it is also has the same authority that the government has in things like religious activity. So that's dynamic. That's the ideal situation to get to, okay? Then we have receptive, which is where we're referring to procedures for registration and recognition as being primarily to accommodate sort of traditional or established belief systems. So yes, registration and recognition are somewhat differentiated, but they only really accommodate traditional or established groups. They don't accommodate new religious movements. They aren't welcoming new religious movements. They aren't providing sort of adaptive services for religious activity. They aren't trying to enhance and develop the religious and philosophical aspects of the lives of citizens. They're just kind of, they're saying, well, yeah, we'll support you from afar, you know, we'll support traditional groups, you know, but we're not sort of engaged in developing the religious activities or enhancing the religious lives of citizens. Of course, issues persist within the receptive recognition system, of course, but these don't generally impede on the day-to-day religious freedoms of citizens. So an example of that would be, you know, policies that may affect religious organizations in registering, so re-registration, for example, or issues of partial recognition may sometimes be classified as receptive, but you know, these aren't affecting the day-to-day lives of citizens, the day-to-day freedoms of citizens, okay? But they're certainly not dynamic, and that's why I've put them in yellow, because receptive is still not great. You know, it's not ideal. Okay, it's nowhere near as bad as terminal or restrictive, but it is still not great. Then we have these two categories in the middle that are quite similar but are distinct, and I've given them sort of a grayish colours, shades, in order to show that they are somewhat similar. We've firstly got apathetic, which is what a lot of Western countries actually fall into, which is that there exist procedures for legal recognition, but not for existential recognition, yet freedom of religion or belief is broadly upheld. So an example of this would be Australia, where legal registration for religious groups is bestowed. Yes, it is available to all groups. They can get tax exempt status, but there is not a sort of procedure for existential recognition. So there's no procedures for Christianity as a belief system to be recognized, or I don't know, Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, as a religious community to be recognized existentially, okay? Yet freedom of religion or belief is widely upheld by the government. The reason why I've called it apathetic is that these types of governments generally want to stay away from the religious activities of citizens. They are generally secular countries, but you know, they they're not engaging religious activity. They're not dynamic. They're not adaptive. They're not providing services to religious activities. They're not to religious organizations. They are sort of taking a back seat, really, to the religious activities of citizens. Then we have, and there are many different reasons why that is wrong and why that's not great, why that is not ideal. Because some people may think, well, what's wrong with that? There's nothing majorly wrong with it. There really isn't, but it's not the ideal scenario. It is not the ideal scenario to me. And this is, of course, why I've developed this spectrum. So then we move on to ambiguous. So we're going down the the ranks here, getting worse as we go on. We've got ambiguous, which is procedures for recognition, nor registration are non-existent. So there are no procedures for recognition or registration of religious groups. Typically, but not always, this is to maintain a hegemony of one group. Okay, so this is generally to maintain the dominance of a single group, essentially. We've got things like Iraq is a little bit like this, Yemen, possibly Somalia, some of these countries that are going through maybe Libya, going through sort of political upheavals. They generally don't have the structures in place, the procedures in place for recognizing or registering religious activity or religious groups. This can be done just because of the situation, so unintentionally, or this can be done intentionally. In the case of Yemen, it's done intentionally. So we've got ambiguous there. Then we move into the three now worse areas. These are the really bad ones. So we've got restrictive, which is actually probably what a majority of countries will fall into. So in a restrictive country, there are administrative hurdles and legal restrictions are in effect, yet these restrictions are not maintained by means of violence. That's the main difference between restrictive and the next category down called censorious, okay? Restriction or restrictive means that, yes, there are administrative hurdles, maybe some groups can receive recognition, others cannot, and that governments are actively restricting religious activity, restricting who can be registered, who cannot, but this is not maintained by means of violence. Whereas in censorious countries, this is maintained by periodic violence, okay? Not systematic, not systematic means of violence, which is of course terminal, but there are reports of violence and also violent retributions, things like imprisonment, torture, maybe even capital punishment, but generally capital punishment will be in terminal groups. And then, of course, we've got terminal. So ongoing systematic violence is enacted by the state in order to maintain its restrictions on religious and belief activity. So let's just give you some examples of these different countries. So at the moment, there are no countries that I've classified at this moment as being dynamic. By the end of my PhD, maybe a couple might be classified as dynamic, but right now there are no countries in the world that are dynamic in their recognition systems. So there's a lot of work to do. There are a couple of countries that are classified as receptive, but that I've said are very close to becoming dynamic. Some of those countries include Belgium, Belize, Cyprus, Iceland, can't think of any more. There are a couple more. Those are countries I've said, yeah, are close to being dynamic, but they just need to do a few different things in order to become dynamic. Receptive, there's a lot of countries that are receptive. A lot of countries in Europe will be receptive. I think Finland is receptive. Probably France, I think. Spain perhaps is receptive. Probably a lot of countries in South America probably would be receptive, and in the Caribbean and North America, of course. There's a lot of countries as well in Western Europe that are apathetic, that I've classified as apathetic, including Australia. Ambiguous, like I've just said, there's places like Yemen, Somalia, I think is ambiguous. Somalia might be terminal, actually. Usually, sometimes what I've done is because I've classified the country as terminal, I've also said ambiguous terminal or ambiguous restrictive, because there are sort of subcategories within ambiguous classification that mean that the country it doesn't have a recognition system in place, but it is not terminal. It is not using violence to maintain that. So it would be restrictive. So it would be ambiguous restrictive. Okay. So there's sort of a couple of subcategories within ambiguous that I've included there. But yeah, things like Yemen, I think Iraq is included as part of that. Possibly Libya as well. Restrictive, most countries in the world are restrictive, actually. A lot of countries are. We've got places like, I mean, there's some countries that are even worse. I mean, quite a few countries in Africa will be restrictive, possibly Chad. These might even be worse than restrictive, actually. I should have got the slides up. Places like perhaps Brazil might be restrictive, it could be receptive. I'm still deciding on some of these countries, you see, I'm still researching. But yeah, a lot of countries in Africa probably be restrictive. Censorious, we've got countries like Jordan, Russia's terminal, China's terminal. I think India we've done censorious. I think Indonesia is censorious. North Korea is of course terminal. Bhutan, I think I've done as censorious, I think. When my PhD is published, you'll be able to see all the different countries and how they are recognized in this, or how they are categorized, sorry, into these different spectrums. But essentially, that just gives you an overview of the 7 different categories and all the different countries fit within these 7 categories. And they'll move up and down as time goes on. By the end of my PhD, some countries may have moved up, like Sudan. Sudan's made really good headways in the last couple of years. And now I would say Sudan is moving more towards being receptive. Not dynamic by any means, but definitely receptive. Whereas originally, you know, it was terminal just a few years ago. So countries can move up the scale very quickly if they show a sort of sustained, you know, it has to have taken place for a couple of years. They can't just say, well, we're human rights really good now, you know, and you move straight up to the highest rank in the spectrum. No, you have to show that you're maintaining those high standards in order to move up the scale. This scale is more strict, I would say, than other scales. For example, USERF, the American agency that studies human rights and specifically religious freedoms, they have a different scale to me. Mine's a lot more restrictive, sorry, a lot more strict, I think, a lot more hardline. You know, I've classified some countries as restrictive that USERF have said are not restrictive, but I think they are just because of the knowledge that we have about them. And of course, I focused really with this on the religious recognition systems mainly and the registration procedures for how I've categorized these rather than the broader human rights situation in the country. Okay. So now I'm going to read out the sort of 9 steps of logic of recognitionism. So what this is a narrative that has been established to determine what recognitionism and the sort of fundamentals of recognitionism, essentially, those fundamental aspects really of recognitionism and how I've got to why I think recognition is important, essentially. So we've got these different arrows on there because we're going to follow the arrows round as we get to the end there, the 9th one. So I'm just going to read these out and then we'll go on to the concluding slides for this lecture. So step one of logic is that religious, philosophical, or spiritual beliefs form a central part of the identity of an individual, which then comes to affect the whole life of that person. So just a little note as well, as I'm reading through these different steps of logic, please just pause and really think about what I'm trying to say with these. I'm not going to elaborate on each of these, but what I want you to do is just pause the screen and just really think about what I'm trying to say there. The fact that this is affecting the whole life of the person, okay? That recognition or lack thereof of the person's identity affects their whole life, okay? Step 2. The belief identities of a person are established by how they distinguish themselves from others and by involving and associating themselves with those who identify as they do. Step 3. The state has a responsibility to at least acknowledge the existence of the religious, spiritual, or philosophical aspects of the lives of its citizens in order to provide sufficient services and to protect and uphold the human right of belonging to whatever belief system one chooses. So that was quite a hefty one there. So just pause it and read it again on the screen, and then just think about what I'm trying to say and how my logic is going as I'm getting closer to the resolution that I'm coming to, which is, of course, that recognition is so important. Number 4 step of logic is that recognition of the beliefs of citizens therefore acts as a central tool that the state may employ to fulfill this responsibility that it has to its citizens. The 5th step of logic states, however, recognition, due to its status as a powerful mechanism with a multiplicity of dimensions, can be used with both positive and beneficial effects for religious groups or for negative, sometimes nefarious purposes. Okay? The number 6 step of logic states that the abuse and misuse of recognition plays a part in various social issues, including poverty, disproportionately experienced by minorities, terrorism, and violence, as well as both the ostracism and disenfranchisement of the unrecognized. Okay. Step 7. I actually can't read that because my thing's in the way, sorry. Step 7, in many countries today, there exists insufficient systems that lack the dynamism that recognizing citizens' diverse belief identities requires. Moreover, some of these systems are established with the intention of controlling and restricting religious activity rather than to genuinely recognize and give support to religious and belief communities. Okay. So step 8. Oh, 9 came before 8. So apologies there. Step 8 states that in order to deal with the consequences that misrecognition or non-recognition brings about in society, a much greater focus needs to be placed on recognition's role in the provision of freedom of religion or belief, especially by international human rights instruments, as well as by governments who wish to improve their approach to maintaining cohesive societies that champion religious freedoms. And then finally, step 9, logic of recognitionism states that a framework for a recognition system that sustainably manages the relations between the state and the religious, philosophical, and spiritual activities of citizens needs to be delineated and then consistently improved upon in order to deal with the ongoing issues that these communities face when the powers of recognition are not applied in the spirit of the principles of pluralism and multiculturalism. So there's a huge amount of work there going on, a huge amount of complex work going on there. Just take them in bite size and just try and digest each of those steps of logic that I've got to. And of course, as I go on, I'll improve the clarity of this work. I'll improve the clarity of my explanations of recognitionism, but hopefully you've got a good sort of outline really of what recognitionism is with those 9 steps. We also have the 9 steps of establishing a recognition agency. So I'm gonna do the same for those. I'm gonna outline those now. Just give me a moment while I just get ready here. So the first step states that a recognition system is the set of mechanisms, this includes laws, policies, procedures put in place for the recognizing or registering of religion or belief in a country. So upon establishing this system, the question remains as to what entity will implement these mechanisms and oversee their correct functioning. In this, we come to the concept of a recognition agency. So step 2 in establishing a recognitions agency states that as such, a recognition agency is the organization responsible for actioning and monitoring the success of the mechanisms of this established recognition system. Okay. Step 3 states that in order to ensure its efficacy, this recognition agency must possess the attributes of authority, autonomy, and accountability. These 3 attributes form this agency's foundations, but they may also possess significant variation in the degree to which they are upheld. Okay. Step 4 states that essentially the agency must exhibit authoritativeness in its declarations and its implementations in order for these to be treated with respect. That its activities must be autonomous from any overarching political entity, such as government. Finally, that it must also equally be accountable to its actions. Step 5 states that the agency's authoritativeness would be attained through its establishment by government and its vested powers to recognize and register manifestations of religion or belief with the same significance as if government had made those decisions itself. So that's how you attain that authoritativeness. Number 6, the autonomy of this agency will be attained through the government's relinquishing of its control over the agency following its establishment, therefore handing sole leadership to its appointed agency heads, or sort of like a board of directors. The leadership structure of the agency is expected to vary from country to country, but the structure of a panel of directors with a single executive director whom is appointed by vote is recommended. So step 7 states that the issue arises not in the theoretical concept of an autonomous, authoritative, and accountable recognition agency being able to fulfill its intended role, but instead the issue arises as to the practicability of its establishment. So will a government practically allow a recognition agency of this kind to be established? Again, 9's come before 8, sorry. Step 8 states that countries currently designated as terminal, censorious, restrictive, or ambiguous in the spectrum of religious recognition are not to be approached with this concept of the recognition agency. Firstly, because their endeavors should be focused in trying to dismantle their misused recognition systems. And secondly, that the impracticability of such a recognition agency truly being authoritative, autonomous, and accountable in such countries has a high likelihood unless compromises are made in how the recognition agency is established. And then step 9, which is the final step, states that it is for these reasons that the concept of a recognition agency should be focused on those countries currently designated as apathetic and receptive. For countries designated otherwise, the likelihood of having to compromise on the nature of the recognition agency they establish is high. In such a case, The distinction again will be made between a dynamic recognition agency, which is embodied by authority, autonomy, and accountability, and all other types of recognition agencies, namely those which are government controlled and do not possess these three key attributes. So what we're trying to essentially say there is essentially explore the fact that, yes, there are these different means of establishing, there's this steps to establishing a recognition agency. And of course, there are countries that can't think about that right now. They just can't, because they're not at that stage. For example, China. There will be no point in me or even the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief going to China and expecting China in its current condition to, under its current policies, to establish a recognition system that was autonomous, authoritative, and accountable. There's no point. But what we can do is try and get other countries that are more receptive to engage with this idea in order to eventually become, of course, dynamic. So then finally, we come to section 4 of this presentation, which obviously is embodied by a few concluding slides. What I really wanted to show here was of course, firstly, the related books. So we've got the Institutional Dictionary of Astronism, which has just been published in March of this year and is now available in digital and paperback formats. So, and then of course, we have the Institutional Dictionary of Freedom of Religion or Belief, which is coming this summer. It's almost done. I just want to perfect it, you know, and make it as good as possible. So it is on the way. And of course, that will be explaining all of the things that I've talked about in here and more. So please look out for that this summer. That's the Institutional Dictionary of Freedom of Religion or Belief by yours truly. Then we have just some little notes from me, you know, my ambitions for the future. Of course, my primary goal at the moment is to attain my doctorate and continue lecturing, which I love doing, but also to work in the field of freedom of religion or belief, human rights and religious education. Someone who watched my episode 9 of A Conversation with Cometan with Stephen Wolfe will have realized that I was speaking to Stephen about human rights in outer space, and that was a really interesting conversation. That's an area that I really want to specialize in the future. So I'll work as hard as I possibly can to do that. And of course, you know, my specialty also wants to focus on government restriction of religious activity, specifically, you know, generally, but also especially but through means of recognition. And then also, of course, ongoing is the work with Astronism that I do and wanting to gain recognition for Astronism in different countries. I do think that and it's kind of fitting as well for the establishment era that we're just going into. One of the main goals for the Astronist Institution right now is, in this new era, is to gain recognition for Astronism around the world. So as we begin to go through these procedures, I will, you know, be able to see from firsthand what these countries are actually expecting of these religious groups to do in terms of their recognition procedures. So I think as time goes on and as I try and get recognition for Astronism, my understanding of how these countries recognize religions in reality, you know, in the practical level, will definitely improve, which will then in turn improve my my work in the area. I just wanted to put this nice quote in here, is that we must not ever compromise on our right to freedom. One thing that I just wanted to quickly say was that, yes, the spectrum of religious recognition is fairly strict. And I think I've been very strict with which countries are classified as receptive and restrictive and so on. The reason why I've done that is because I don't compromise on freedom of religion or belief. Freedom of religion or belief and all human rights are not to be compromised on. Governments have to uphold these as one of their fundamental duties as governments. So I do not, in any way, shape, or form, compromise on the right to freedom. Okay. And no one else should either. So that's the philosophy that I'm taking. And that's the quote that I always have in the back of my mind when I'm looking at countries. Well, this country is doing sort of half good, but then other areas it's not doing so good, then it's restrictive. You can't have half and half. It's either you are with human rights or you aren't with human rights. Okay. If you want to take a look at the proposal that I've created for my PhD work, you can do so by clicking the link. Also on my website, you should now be able to see my ethics and methodology document, which again might give you some more interesting background to my work. Again, you can find that on cometan.org under the same heading at the top of the screen under freedom of religion, I think it is. And of course, thank you all for listening about recognitionism, and I hope that, you know, in the future I'll do more lectures on this. This is going to be my main area that I'm interested in for my future academic career, and I hope that recognitionism does make an impact in the world, specifically on the human rights field. Please continue to watch the end of season 2 of Conversation with Cometan. I think we've now, by the time this video goes out as episode 15, we will have finished the total immersion series within a Conversation with Cometan season 2. So I think we will be moving on to the TerraSem Space Day, which will be really exciting, which is going to be with a lot of great people, a lot of great speakers will be there. Giulio Prisco, of course, is the host of that event. So very much looking forward to speaking at that event, and that will be probably one of the final episodes of season 2 of A Conversation with Cometan. This season has just been so amazing. We've had so many cool videos. It has developed in a way that I didn't think it would. It's gone amazing, and I just want to keep this on, of course, hopefully for season 3. So I will now end the lecture, and I encourage you to take a look at and just keep up with my work that I'm doing. So thanks everybody, and see you in the next episode of A Conversation with Cometan.